The whole thing started, basically, innocently enough, with the purchase of a book, an old book. It was a travel book, or as I found out more precisely when I opened it, it was one in a series of travel books entitled Histoire des Voyages. These things can start with individual travel accounts or encyclopedias filled with compilations of different travel accounts. This little book turned out to be both. It looked small enough, but in fact it opened up to a much wider world because it had fold out maps and plans, which invited you to look at them. You can't, in fact, see a map without trying to situate yourself in relation to that map. It's kind of instinctual. We want to see things visually, but then also place ourselves in relationship to those scenes or drawings. Some of them are straightforward maps and have labels on them that you can read pretty easily. This is in French, so you know they're speaking of jardin, which means gardens. And it looks like the areas here have to do with constructed environments, human engineered fortresses that previously you learned were also part of the foldouts within this strange book. Then you got views from these kinds of fortresses from a distance. Very interesting. And you couldn't help but, again, figure out okay, what's land, what's sea, what's the flag. In fact, you start asking questions immediately of these kinds of illustrated travel books. Well, you're reminded very quickly of The Doctor's Dream. This is a print from 1819, a book that appeared with illustrations by Thomas Rowlandson. Um, entitled, entitled, the whole series is entitled Tour of Dr. Syntax in Search of the Picturesque. Well, at some point, he sits down and starts to dream, dream about different books that he's encountered. It's pretty extraordinary drawing. And it has a sort of a map in the background. It has a view of an area of London at the time that he has in mind. And all of these books are reminding him of different kinds of things, including controversies that are taking place between people who write books. And in his mind, they're all sort of fluttering around. It's fantastic pictorial representation of what goes on in people's minds in dreams, but also in open, awake time thought. You could take a look at these books and begin to drift off yourself. In fact, spewing page after page after the title page, especially when you find out that that's volume 13, and the maps just keep unfolding, unfolding along with views of the castles that are constructed in the west coast of Africa, complete with their floor plans that you can look at in detail, like this one from the Dutch fort at Shama. Now, if we go beyond Dr. Syntax and ask about the historian's dream, you could easily see that this is what goes on when any historian starts to drift off with books in his mind. A book historian dream even more so because they're thinking particularly of the different books that are flying around in the imagination and the controversies that are well illustrated here that might be involved in the writing of these different books. Well, of course, the historical print collector has a similar dream because these books contain prints, and those prints are often in controversy with one another, directly contradicting prints that appeared in earlier editions, and none of them having anything to do with the print on the wall of the print collector, which happens to be a portion of London looking over at the Cathedral of St. Paul's from the other side of the Thames. Well, all of this is, of course, related to the cartographer's dream because inside of this book are lots of plans, diagrams, and maps. And when you turn to the cartographic historian's dream, well, you can see how complicated it gets very quickly because each map has a history to it. And the question is which ones come before other ones? If one comes before another one, is it copied? Or are they both copied from some other source? Well, the whole thing amounts to a bibliophile stream. Anybody who really loves books loves these kinds of ruminations. And of course, if you love books of this kind, you want to make sure that they're preserved. And you could say this represents a bookbinder's dream as well. But think on it a bit. Is it a bookbinder's dream or a bookbinder's nightmare? If you get to rebind these books because they're falling apart and you want to preserve them, that could be a nightmare, a real nightmare, unless you have some help. Well, you can read about how they used to bind these books in the 18th century, but it's much easier to learn from a master who knows about that. Someone like Sam Ellenport here in Boston. Rather than make mistakes on rebinding the book itself, Sam suggested that I start by making boxes to protect them. So I did this, making boxes, and you can see how they fit in, and they look nice to me. But Sam pointed out that they weren't acid-free, and what you need to do is make acid-free clamshells for the whole set of 18 volumes. And I say, well, how do you make a clamshell? And he says, watch. And he proceeds to show me how to make clamshells, and I make several attempts at doing it, usually with larger books, and eventually I get them to stand on their own. Eventually, then as well, I downsize the whole effort and make it work for smaller books. But perhaps you can help me with the end paper question. They don't match. This is faded. The new ones are bright. Well, I'm hoping you can help me with the end paper question, but beyond the end papers, there are many more questions I'm sure you can help me out with. Returning to the historian's dream, for example, there are a lot of enduring questions. Why were these volumes published in this form in the first place? In octavo form, not quarto form. What was the market for these travel books? Who bought them? What was the primary source material behind them? Who copied whom? Who drew these maps? The cartographer would ask. Who drew the maps in each of the volumes? Who provided the geographers with their raw material? Are there manuscript precursors to these published maps? If so, where are they? And by whom were they drawn? Above all, how accurate are these maps in these volumes for the times at which they were published? What is revealed in each of the maps, in fact, and what is left out? What is unrevealed? What is perhaps even hidden? Why are so many of the maps published in French and Dutch simultaneously with labels in both languages on the same page? Why were the Dutch cartographers so prominent in the 17th century and the French in the 18th century? What did the publication of these maps, scenes, and travel accounts have to do with the flourishing of the joint stock company, first in the Netherlands and then throughout Europe? Some new questions then have come from reading old books, especially when we look at imaging and imagining the agroecology and pathology of European empire. You can catch up with other aspects of it by scanning in the QR code and keeping in touch. Thanks to you all, and to all a good night.